The moon had always ruled the wolves. In the age before iron roads and broken borders, when the great northern wilderness was still wild enough to swallow kingdoms whole, the Wolf tribes ruled the land as gods rule the sky, absolute, sovereign, and terrifying. 12 great tribes, 12 alphas, 12 banners raised beneath the same silver moon that had watched their ancestors howl their first breaths into existence. The Ashcroft pack held the eastern cliffs, their wolves black as coal and fast as shadow. The Iron Fang tribe carved their halls into the granite mountains, forging warriors that never fell. The River Song pack ruled the wetlands, their seers whispering futures into the still water at midnight. And in the lush, glowing valley that bloomed even in winter, the Lotus tribe built their palace of pale stone and silver glass, raising diplomats where others raised warriors. For centuries, these 12 clans had existed in an uneasy truce. They warred, they traded, they married and mourned and occasionally slaughtered one another with magnificent cruelty. But one sacred law bound them all above every grudge, every rivalry, every wound that never fully healed. The tribes must never fall to rogues. Rogues were the wolves who had abandoned pack law. Exiled wolves, broken wolves, wolves who had tasted freedom from hierarchy and found, terrifyingly, that they preferred it. Without the structure of a pack, without an alpha's bond grounding their wolf nature, they became something else entirely, more animal than man, more hunger than soul. And for a long time, the rogue threat had been manageable. A lone wolf here, a small band of exiles there. The tribes dealt with them efficiently and moved on. But something had changed. The rogues were no longer alone. Someone or something had united them, given them purpose, given them leadership. And now they moved like a tide of shadow across the northern lands, burning villages, collapsing pack borders, vanishing entire bloodlines as if they had never existed. 3 tribes had already lost outer territories. 2 more were on the verge of collapse. The ancient balance of power was fracturing faster than the Council of 12 could address. Under the vaulted dome of the sacred moon temple, a structure so old that none could say which tribe had built it, only that it had always been there. The 12 alphas gathered by torchlight and argued through the long winter night. Should they unite? Pride would not allow it. Should they each defend their own? Logic screamed that they could not. Should they negotiate with the rogues? Several alphas laughed at this suggestion until the laughter died, because none of them were sure it was actually funny. And then, as all arguments eventually must, the night's debate turned to one named Alpha Damiran of the Silver Pack. He had not spoken yet. He sat apart from the others, in the high seat reserved for whichever alpha held the most territory, the most warriors, and the most fear. His arms were crossed. His gray eyes were flat and unreadable as a winter sky. The torchlight carved shadows into his face that made him look less like a man and more like something carved from the mountain itself. He was 31 years old and had never lost a war. He had taken the Silver Pack Alpha title at 19 when his father died, had expanded their territory 3 times in 12 years, and had crushed for attempts to overthrow him with such devastating efficiency that no one had tried a 5th time. Every alpha in that room had either fought against him or carefully chosen not to. None of them entirely trusted him. Every single one of them needed him. Feared, unforgiving, unbreakable. No one challenged him. No one disobeyed him. And no one, not in any of the 12 tribes, not in any village or wilderness outpost between the mountains and the sea, dared betray him, until fate intervened, because somewhere in the Lotus Valley, a young woman stood on a palace balcony watching the horizon burn, and in the Silver Pack fortress on the mountain cliffs, a king who had never needed anyone felt something ancient and irresistible stir in his chest like a second heartbeat beginning. Neither of them knew it yet, but the moon goddess knew. She always knew. Her name was Miranda Lotus. And their union would either save the 12 tribes or destroy them all. Before we begin, if you love dark Lycan Kings, forbidden mates, and stories that make your heart act like, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe for epic Lycan King romances, where Omegas rise, kings fall, and love is never gentle. The Ruthless Al-Faith Silver Pack fortress had been built by warriors for warriors, and it showed in every stone. It did not perch on the mountain cliffs, so much as it erupted from them towers of black granite rising from the rock face, as if they had always been there and the mountain had merely been waiting to reveal them. The walls were 3 wolves thick and had never been breached. The gates were ironwood reinforced with silver forged steel, and above them, carved in the old tongue, ran the words that every Silver Pack wolf knew before they knew their own name: "We do not fall." Inside the throne hall, The fire burned high even in the depths of what should have been a cold afternoon. The light fell in long ember slabs across the stone floor, illuminating the faces of the assembled warriors, generals, scouts, beta commanders, all of them kneeling in neat, orderly rows. Silence ruled the hall, because Alpha Damian was thinking, and when Damian thought, no one spoke. He stood at the great map table that dominated the center of the hall, one hand pressed to the carved wood surface, gray eyes tracing the network of borders and rivers and elevation marks with the methodical intensity of a man calculating odds. The map was 3 feet wide and made from a single piece of dark yew wood. Pins marked rogue sightings, red for confirmed, black for suspected. The eastern border was practically carpeted in pins. He was tall. Not in the way that some men are tall, slightly inconvenient and awkward, but architecturally tall, built like something designed to dominate a room. His shoulders were broad enough that the doorways of the fortress had been quietly widened twice since he became Alpha. The scars on his forearms caught the firelight, white lines crossing older, darker marks, a map of every battle he had fought and survived. His black hair fell slightly across his forehead. The only disheveled thing about him, his gray eyes missed nothing. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. A scout entered, young, barely 20, dusty from hard riding, and crossed the long floor at a quick walk before dropping to one knee 6 feet from the Alpha. My Alpha. Damian didn't look up from the map. Report. The scout's throat moved. The rogues have taken 3 villages along the eastern border. Highfield, Mill Creek, and the Ashcroft outpost at the river crossing. A ripple moved through the assembled warriors. Barely visible, a tightening of jaws, a shift of weight, but Damian noticed it all. Casualties, he said. Not a question. Everyone, my Alpha. The scout's voice was very quiet. They slaughtered everyone. The hall went absolutely still. Damian straightened slowly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the fire. His Wolf stirred deep beneath his skin, not panic, not grief, but something colder and more purposeful. A dark calculation beginning. How many rogues? He asked. His voice was calm. It was always calm. That was what made it frightening. Hundreds, my Alpha, perhaps more. Our scouts counted over 300 tracks at Highfield alone, and the pattern suggests they moved as a coordinated unit, not a mob. General Corvin stepped forward from the kneeling rows. He was a gray-haired Wolf built like a battering ram, the Silver Pack's oldest and most decorated warrior. He spoke carefully. My Alpha, if we mobilize the full army to the eastern border, the western perimeter will be exposed. The Lotus tribe has been. Damian turned his head. Just that. Just the slow turn of his head, his gray eyes finding Corvin's, and the general's voice simply stopped. Not because Damian had said anything threatening. Because when Damian looked at you directly, you became suddenly and completely aware of how very much he could do to you if he chose to. He held Corvin's gaze for a 3 count, then spoke. The Lotus tribe is weak. Their warriors fight with honor and strategy and every disadvantage those qualities create when the enemy has neither. He turned back to the map. They fear rogues more than they hate me. They will not move while this threat exists. Corvin swallowed. Yes, my Alpha. But just in case, Damian added, tracing a finger along the western line, post a watch company at the Valley Pass. Not to threaten. To observe. Understood. Prepare the army. All 3 brigades. He looked up. We march before the next moonrise. The hall erupted into controlled, efficient motion, every Wolf moving with the precision of a machine that had been built for exactly this. Because Damian had built them, had trained them, hardened them, tested them until the weak links broke and only the unbreakable remained. In the doorway, his beta tall, wolfish man named Soren with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow caught his eye and raised it half a centimeter in question. Damian gave the smallest nod. Mobilize the Wolf cavalry first. Soren told the nearest commander quietly. The Alpha wants speed. He always wanted speed, because speed was the difference between catching the enemy and chasing their shadow. And Alpha Damian of the Silver Pack never chased shadows. He eliminated the source of them. The Lotus Princess, the Lotus Valley, was the kind of place that made you believe, briefly and painfully, that the world was still. Beautiful. It sat cupped between 2 gentle mountain ranges like something, cradled in careful hands, a sweep of soft land where the trees grew silver-barked, and the rivers ran clear as glass over smooth pale stones. In winter, when every other territory turned gray and brutal, the Lotus Valley bloomed with frost flowers, white blossoms that opened in freezing temperatures and filled the air with a scent like cold honey. The palace rose at the valley's heart, built not of dark granite but pale limestone and blue-gray slate. its towers slender and graceful, its windows full of warm light. It was beautiful. It was also, increasingly, a fortress under siege. Miranda Lotus stood on the highest palace balcony and watched the eastern sky burn. Not literally, not yet, but the smoke from the border villages rose in thick dark columns that turned the sunset bloody. And in the light of that smoke-stained sky, the frost flowers looked less like beauty and more like a funeral offering. She was 24 years old and had been called many things. Beautiful, a word she received with polite weariness, because she had not asked for it and it had never once been. Useful, diplomatic, a word she valued more, having worked hard to earn it. Soft, a word that came, always, from people who had never seen what stillness costs, who mistook a quiet exterior for an absence of iron. She was tall for a lotus Wolf, with dark hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of deep water, dark blue shifting to gray depending on the light. She wore a pale blue gown and a silver moon pendant at her throat, the traditional jewelry of an unmarried lotus princess, and she stood very still in the freezing wind as if she had decided the cold could not touch her. Behind her, the door opened. Miranda, her father's voice. She didn't turn immediately. She let herself have 3 more seconds of watching the sky, the burning columns, the ruined colors, the world her people had built being hidden from the edges, and then she turned. Alpha Rowan Lotus had been handsome once, in the way of old portraits and faded stories. He was still distinguished, silver hair, good bones, the bearing of a man who had been born to lead. But the last month had put 10 years on him, and his eyes, which had once been steady and warm, were now carrying the weight of impossible choices. Miranda recognized that weight. She had been watching it settle onto him for weeks. "You're going to ask me to do something I won't like," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply true. Her father crossed to the balcony railing and stood beside her, looking out at the smoke-colored sky. "We cannot survive this war alone," he said. "Our warriors are brave, I have never doubted that. But brave wolves against 300 rogues operating as a military unit is not battle. It is attrition. And we are losing. I know. I have been in correspondence with the other tribes. The ones who haven't already lost their outer territories are fortifying inward, abandoning the borders. If the road tide reaches the valley, father, if it reaches the valley, Miranda, we cannot hold this palace." Silence. The wind moved through the silver bark trees below, sending frost flowers spinning from the branches in little cold spirals. "Tell me," she said, "there is only one alpha powerful enough to turn the tide. One pack with the military strength, the strategy, and the will to actually stop what is coming rather than merely slow it." She already knew the name. She had known it for weeks, in the way you know a thing is coming before it arrives, when the evidence accumulates too clearly to deny. "Damiurn," she said. "Alpha Damiurn of the Silver Pack." The name dropped between them like a stone into still water. She had heard the stories. Every Wolf in the 12 tribes had heard them, because stories about Damiurn were not the kind that stayed local. They traveled, spreading from territory to territory like the ripples from that stone, growing with each retelling until you were no longer certain where the truth ended and the legend began. Damiurn, who had taken his father's title at 19 and immediately executed the 3 generals who had been quietly running the pack in his father's final failing months, not because they had done anything overtly treasonous, but because they had made themselves powerful enough to be a future threat. And Damiurn had decided to solve future problems early. Damiurn, who had fought the northern rogue incursion of 4 years ago with 300 wolves against 900 and somehow won, leaving the battlefield in 2 days when it should have taken 2 weeks. The rogue leader's heads displayed at every border crossing of his territory as a message that translated cleanly across every language barrier. "Do not try this again." Damiurn, who had not taken a Luna, not in 12 years of rule, not because no one was worthy. It was quietly understood that several alphas had offered daughters, alliances, advantageous marriages, but because Damiurn did not appear to need anyone, which was perhaps the most frightening thing about him. Men who need nothing cannot be leveraged. Men who need nothing have no weakness. What does he want in return? Miranda asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Her father was quiet for a long moment. In the valley below, a wolf was howling one long, sorrowful note that the wind carried upward until it faded. "He wants you," her father finally said. Miranda turned to look at him. "A political marriage. An alliance sealed by mating bond. His protection and military resources in exchange for me," she finished. Not bitterly, precisely. "You would become his Luna. The Silver Pack would commit their full force to defending the valley and hunting the rogue threat. He met her eyes. I will not pretend this is not a sacrifice. I will not pretend it is fair, or easy, or what I would have chosen for you. But thousands of lives, I understand, she said. Miranda, father. She touched his arm briefly. I understand. I have understood since the first smoke column appeared on the eastern horizon. She looked back out at the burning sky. I've had weeks to decide how I feel about it. And how do you feel? She was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, she gathered something inside herself, all the fear, all the uncertainty, all the deeply reasonable dread of being handed to a man who was spoken of the way storm systems are spoken of, and she wrapped it tight and set it aside. Later, she would be afraid. Later, I feel that I will marry him, she said, and that I will not be a sacrifice if I choose not to be. Her father looked at her for a long time. Then he put his arms around her, carefully, the way he had when she was small and the world had seemed manageable. She let herself lean into it for exactly 10 seconds. Then she straightened and looked at the horizon with clear, dark eyes. The Alpha King's British came with 2 guards. This, more than anything else, was what the Silver Pack wolves talked about afterward. Not her face, though they talked about that too, and not the white gown embroidered with silver moon symbols, or the small, composed smile she wore as if she were arriving somewhere she had chosen rather than somewhere she had been sent. They talked about the 2 guards. Most alphas, when marrying into an alliance with the Silver Pack, would have sent their heir with an escort of 20 warriors, full ceremonial armor, a display of strength calibrated precisely to announce, we are not weak, we are not afraid, we are doing you a favor. The posturing was as ritualized as a dance. Miranda Lotus came with 2 guards and her head high and her hands unshaking. And that simplicity somehow communicated more quiet confidence than all the armor in the 12 tribes. The fortress gates opened for her. She rode through without hesitation. In the throne hall, Damian waited. He stood rather than sat, a detail he had decided upon deliberately. Because sitting felt passive and he did not conduct himself passively, and he had dressed with unusual care, which Soren had noticed and wisely said nothing about. Dark formal armor, silver embossed at the shoulders. His hair still fell slightly across his forehead. He had decided not to fix it, which was not vanity, it was the calculated choice of a man who knew that perfect presentation communicates nervousness. And Damian communicated nothing he did not intend. The hall was full. Every ranking Wolf in the Silver Pack stood along the walls, lined up in their formal positions, because this was a political event as much as anything else. And political events required witnesses. The doors opened. She walked in. And the air changed. Damian had been in hundreds of high-pressure situations, battles, negotiations, executions, councils where men tried to outwit him and failed. He had developed, over the years, a very complete immunity to surprise. He simply processed whatever arrived in front of him and responded accordingly, without the interruption of feeling. He was not prepared for the way something in his chest, deep, animal, older than thought, simply lurched awake when she walked through the door. His Wolf went very still. Then it said, with absolute certainty, the word it had never said before in 31 years of his existence: mate. He held himself completely motionless. No reaction visible, not a flicker in the gray eyes, not a tightening of his jaw. He had years of practice holding himself still against impulses, and he used all of them in that moment while his Wolf screamed in his chest and his rational mind said, with cold authority, impossible. She was the Lotus Princess. She was his political tool, his alliance mechanism, the thing he had requested because it made strategic sense to attach the Lotus tribe to the Silver Pack through a bond that could not be diplomatically dissolved. She was not supposed to be his mate. And yet, Miranda crossed the long floor without pausing. She walked past the kneeling ranks without looking at them. She kept her eyes on him, which was remarkable. Most people, even veteran warriors, found it difficult to hold Damian's gaze for more than a few seconds. She held it all the way across the hall and stopped 6 feet away with her chin lifted at an angle that communicated very clearly that she knew exactly where she was and had made peace with it on her own terms. Up close, he could feel the pull. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't politics. It was the deep, bone-level recognition of a mate bond beginning like two things that had been separate, finally, against all logic, aligning. She felt it too. He could see it in the brief, involuntary stillness that moved through her, a half-second pause before she composed herself again. But she composed herself. That, more than anything, was interesting. You came willingly, he said. His voice came out level. Good. I came to protect my people, she replied. Her voice was steady and clear. No trembling. He noted this. And you understand your position here. A small, precise pause. I understand my purpose, Alpha Daemon. Her eyes didn't drop. I am here to cement an alliance that protects thousands of innocent wolves from being slaughtered in their homes. I am not here because I am weak or frightened or because my father sold me. I am here because I chose to be here, and that distinction matters to me. The hall held its breath. No one spoke to Daemon that way. Not the frankness was acceptable in private, but the public declaration of terms, the refusal to accept the subordinate framing of her own arrival. That was new. Something moved through his chest that was not entirely unpleasant. Bold, he said quietly. She waited. The ceremony will take place tonight, he said. Under the full moon. He paused. Welcome to the Silver Pack, Princess. Luna, she said. Quietly, clearly. He looked at her. If I am to be your Luna, she said, then you may call me Luna, not Princess, not guest, Luna. For 3 seconds. The silence was absolute. Then, without any change in expression, Daemon nodded once. Luna, he agreed. And in the Silver Pack Fortress, for the first time in 12 years, something in the Ruthless Alpha King cracked open, just slightly, just enough to let light in. The mate-bombed moonstone stood at the center of the inner courtyard, and it was nothing like Miranda had expected. She had imagined something dramatic, a towering obelisk, perhaps, or a carved altar dripping with old power. Instead, the moonstone was low and wide, barely knee-height, its surface worn smooth by centuries of hands and the accumulated weight of ceremonies older than the 12 tribes themselves. It was pale as bone and warm as blood, which should have been impossible for a stone standing in the winter air. But there it was, warm, alive, somehow, in the way that very old things occasionally are. The ceremony was not long. There were no elaborate speeches, no hours of ritual. The Silver Pack did not perform, they acted. The pack elder, an ancient woman named Myra, who moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to carrying great weight lightly, raised her carved staff and called the moon's attention with 3 words in the old tongue that made the air vibrate. The assembled pack surrounded them in a wide circle, hundreds of wolves, all in human form, all silent in a way that felt less like deference and more like held breath. Miranda stood beside Daemon and was, for the first time since arriving, aware of how very real this was. She had thought, in the days since her father's words on the balcony, that she had fully processed what she was agreeing to. She was wrong. Processing it in the abstract, in the smoke-scented air of her home valley, was a different thing entirely from standing beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cold air, close enough to notice that he smelled like wood smoke and cold pine and something darker, older, specifically his, and knowing that in a few moments this would be permanent. She looked at the moonstone, she breathed, she thought of the burning horizon, the smoke columns, the empty villages, the faces of the people she had grown up alongside, whose children she knew by name, who had trusted her family to protect them. She thought, I choose this. And the wolf inside her, which had always been quieter than other wolves, more contemplative, less inclined to the fierce territorial certainties that most pack wolves experienced, her wolf agreed, simply, without drama. Yes. Do you, Alpha Daemon Silver, take Miranda Lotus as your Luna? Do you accept responsibility for her life, her safety, and her sovereignty within your pack as equal to your own? Daemon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Miranda noticed that the wording was slightly different from what he had likely expected. The elder had added that last clause, her sovereignty, equal to his own, and he had not been given the opportunity to review it in advance. For 2 seconds, he was very still. Then he looked at Miranda, not the elder, directly at her, with those flat gray eyes that were not, up close, quite as unreadable as advertised. Yes, he said. The elder turned. Do you, Miranda Lotus, take Daemon Silver as your alpha and mate? Do you accept this bond freely, without coercion, of your own full will? Freely, she confirmed. Of my own full will. Place your hands on the moonstone together. They both reached forward. Miranda's fingers touched the warm stone, a heartbeat before his large hand came down beside hers. And then their fingers were side by side on the moonstone surface, not quite touching. And she thought, this is the last moment before everything changes. And then their hands touched, both touching the stone and each other at the same time. The light that came from the moonstone was not a gentle glow. It was a detonation, silver-white, blazing, impossibly bright for something that had no source. It erupted upward in a column that lit the courtyard like a second moon. sending shadows racing in every direction. And every Wolf in the circle staggered back a step on pure instinct. Miranda felt it move through her like a current, like something being rewired at a level deeper than thought, like the ground beneath her rearranging itself so that standing beside this man was its new, permanent configuration. The bond snapped into place. It was not gentle. It was not subtle. It arrived with the force of a fundamental truth suddenly and irrevocably known. She was his. He was hers. The animal in her chest recognized the animal in his chest and went quiet, not with submission, but with the deep, unargued certainty of something that has finally found the place it belongs. Damien made a sound that was almost inaudible, a sharp, involuntary breath, quickly controlled. She heard it. She felt it, through the bond, like an echo. The elder's voice, when she spoke, was full of something Miranda had not heard there before. "Ah, the moon goddess has spoken. What do you mean?" Damien asked. His voice was tied in a way she recognized from the brief, overwhelming minutes of the bond's arrival, as him holding himself together through considerable effort. The elder looked at them both. Her ancient eyes were wide. "You are not only married by alliance," she said. "The moon goddess has confirmed what the stone has revealed." She bowed her head. "You are fated mates. True mates, chosen before either of you was born." The courtyard erupted. Whispers first, then voices, then the low, rolling sound of hundreds of wolves simultaneously, reacting to information that changed everything they thought. They understood about this alliance. Miranda stood very still at the center of it. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the moonstone, at the last fading traces of that impossible light. Fated mates, not strategy, not politics, not sacrifice. Destiny. She felt him looking at her. She turned to meet his gaze and found something in it she had not seen there before, not the flat gray calculation, but something raw and uncertain and deeply, surprisingly human. Good, she thought. Let him be uncertain. Let them both be uncertain together. That was fair. That was a beginning. The war begins. The attack came 48 hours after the wedding. In the small hours of the third night, while the Silver Pack fortress still hummed with the aftermath of the ceremony, the political calculations, the tribal messengers, the quiet, seismic shift of power that comes when two major packs formally unite. The eastern watchtowers sent up 3 red flares in quick succession. The old signal. The worst signal. Enemy forces. Mass movement. Contact imminent. In 3 minutes, the fortress was fully awake and moving with the smooth, lethal efficiency of a war machine, engaging armor, weapons, formation assignments. The Silver Pack did not panic. They had trained for exactly this, had been training for it for months. And the preparation paid off in the calm, purposeful speed with which 1,200 wolves prepared for battle. Damien came out of the command tower already in his armor, Soren at his shoulder, a war map in his hand that he was already rendering obsolete with new information as it came in. Miranda was waiting at the base of the tower stairs. She was dressed for a fight, not in a ball gown, not in the white ceremony dress. She wore leather riding armor in the Lotus tribe tradition, pale gray, reinforced at the shoulders and joints, fitted to move in rather than to impress. Her dark hair was braided back. There were 2 long knives at her belt, and her expression communicated that she intended to use them. Damien stopped. "No," he said. "I'm your Luna," she replied. Same tone she'd used the first day. Clear, unargued. "You are also untested in a mass engagement, unfamiliar with Silver Pack battle formation, and the Lotus tribe has been fighting rogue incursions on our borders for 4 months," she said. "I have been in 3 of them. I know how rogues move. I know their patterns." She looked at him steadily. "I am also your Luno, which means the pack bond is mine as much as yours. I can feel every Wolf in your pack right now, Damien. Can you really afford not to have that on the field?" Silence. She watched him calculate. She could feel it through the bond, the reluctance warring with the tactical reality, the instinct to protect her warring with the equally powerful recognition that she was right. "You stay in the second line until I call you forward," he said finally. His voice was controlled. "Agreed," she said. "If you break formation, I won't." He looked at her for one more moment, long enough that she felt, through the bond, something complicated that she didn't have a name for yet, and then he turned back to his commanders. "Move out." They found the rogues at the valley pass, not hundreds, as the early reports suggested, but thousands. Miranda stood in the Silver Pack's second line on a rocky rise overlooking the valley floor and felt something drop cold and heavy in her chest as the scale of it became clear. The rogue force was vast. It moved like a dark tide across the snow-covered ground below, wolves in shifted form and human form mixed together, disciplined in a way that rogues simply were not supposed to be. Someone had trained them. Someone had organized them. This was not a raiding party or a territorial push, this was an army. The Silver Pack met them at the tree line. The battle was, and Miranda had been in 3 skirmishes. Had thought she understood what fighting looked like, utterly unlike anything she had experienced. 3 skirmishes had not prepared her for the sound of 2,000 wolves engaging simultaneously. The ground-shaking concussion of it, the air full of howls and impacts, and the specific, awful sounds of injuries at scale. But the Silver Pack held. More than held, they pushed. She could see Damien in the thick of it, his great wolf form a dark silver gray that was almost black, moving through the rogue lines with terrifying efficiency. The pack fought as a single organism around him, anticipating each other's movements, covering weaknesses, pressing advantages. It was extraordinary to witness. It was also, she was honest with herself, winning. And then something happened that she had not anticipated. The bond hummed, and her wolf answered it. She had always known her wolf was different. Quieter than most, yes, but the quietness had always felt like it was covering something, like stillness over deep water. She had never fully shifted, not in a battle context, had never felt the need, had always been more useful in her human form with her knives and her tactics, but the bond was pulling at her, and her wolf was responding to the battle below, and before she had fully decided to. She was changing. The shift took her like a tide, and what emerged was not what any wolf in the 12 tribes had expected. Her wolf was silver white, not gray, not pale brown, but the clear, pure silver white of moonlight, and it glowed, not brilliantly, not blinding, but a soft luminescence that moved through her coat like light through water, and where she moved, the rogues hesitated, not out of confusion, out of fear. Something deep and old in the rogue wolves recognized what she was, something that bypassed training and organization and the dark bond that had been forcing them together, and went straight to the animal truth. There are things in this world older than pack law. There are wolves touched by the moon goddess herself, and this was one of them. Miranda moved into the battle. The rogues fell back around her as if she were fire, creating space where there had been none, breaking formations that had been holding for hours. The Silver Pack surged into the gaps. Damien turned from the engagement he was in, which his subordinate immediately covered, and stared at his mate, with an expression she had never seen on his face. She looked like a myth made real. She looked like the moon goddess's blessing, walking on 4 legs. He had requested the Lotus Princess for political advantage. He had been given something else entirely, the shadow of faith. Battle ended an hour before dawn. The rogues broke at the tree line. When their left flank collapsed, Miranda's presence had been the pivot point, creating the psychological fracture that the Silver Pack's tactical superiority then tore wide open. Bodies lay across the snow. Prisoners were contained and secured with the efficient grimness of wolves who had done this before. Damien walked the battlefield in the gray pre-dawn light, Soren beside him, cataloging the tactical data with the detached professionalism of a general and the underlying fury of a wolf whose territory had been threatened. He processed it methodically. Numbers, positions, formations, the weapons the rogues had carried. And then he stopped. In the center of the field, at the place where the rogue line had broken, something had been written in the snow. Not carved. This was deliberate, artful, done while the battle still raged, by someone who had moved through it without engaging. The letters were 2 feet tall, clean, confident. He read them. The temperature seemed to drop. Orion read them beside him and went very still. 4 words. The Luna belongs to me. The shadow. Alpha. They had heard the name, had been hearing it for months, in reports from scouts and refugees and the desperate communiques of collapsing tribes. A rogue leader, not just an alpha who had gone rogue, but something more structured, a wolf who had systematically united the rogue packs under a single hierarchy, giving them the discipline and the numbers to function as an army rather than a mob. The Shadow Alpha had no known name, no confirmed face. He moved between rogue groups like smoke, never in one place long enough to be tracked, never leading a battle himself, only directing, organizing, appearing in the aftermath to consolidate power. And now he had announced, in writing, in the blood-stained snow of the Valley Pass, that he wanted Miranda. Damien's wolf surged in his chest with a fury that was unlike anything he had felt since his early territorial battles. Not the cold, strategic anger. He was accustomed to the clean fury of a commander, whose plans have been opposed, but something primitive and violent and possessive. in a way that went well beyond politics. She is mine, not as an asset, not as a Luna for the Pack's political stability. Mine. The Bond was very clear on this point. He was here, Soren said quietly, during the battle. That means he was watching the whole time. He saw her shift, he knew, Damien said. What do you mean? He knew about her, Wolf, about what she is. This wasn't a standard territorial push. Damien looked up from the message in the snow. He came here for her. The battle was the distraction. Soren processed this. Then he didn't take her. He wasn't ready. Or he wanted her to know he was coming. Or both. He turned back toward the fortress. His stride was very controlled, very even, the walk of a man who has decided something and is now organizing the implementation. Miranda was at the fortress gates, having shifted back and been given a cloak by one of the pack wolves who had seen the state of her armor. She looked tired but uninjured, which was the only information Damien needed for the next 30 seconds. Then he reached her. I need to speak with you, he said. She looked at his face. He watched her read something there. She was getting better at reading him through the bond before his expression confirmed anything. It's serious, she said. Not a question. Yes. She nodded and fell into step beside him. That night, in the War Council, they laid out what they knew. The Shadow Alpha was not a rogue raider. He was a movement. He was organized, resourced, and strategic. And he had now revealed that he had a specific objective. Miranda. Why Miranda? The whole council asked the question. And Damien answered it flatly. Because of what she is. The moon goddesses marked Wolf, the silver lotus. Ancient texts describe it. He looked at the pack elder, who nodded.
A wolf like Miranda bonded to a Shadow Alpha would give him something no rogue pack has ever had. Legitimacy, said Soren. Legitimacy, Damien confirmed. And power. The kind that comes from the moon goddess's blessing, rather than from terror. The table was quiet. He won't wait long, Miranda said. Her voice was calm in a way that Damien was coming to understand was her version of composure under pressure. He revealed himself tonight because he wants us rattled. He wants us to react before we're prepared. Then we won't react, Damien said. He looked at her. We prepare. Their eyes met across the table, and in that look, something shifted again between them. The alliance that had been political becoming something else. The bond that had snapped into place now pulling tighter. The Ruthless Alpha and the Lotus Luna beginning in the crucible of shared threat to actually trust each other. It was not safe, this trust, but it was real. Fire and moonlight. The weeks that followed were forged in the particular intensity that only exists when people are working toward survival. Miranda took her role as Luna with a seriousness that the Silver Pack, after some initial skepticism, began to respect. She was not what they had expected, not the decorative political prize that the circumstances of her arrival had suggested. She trained with the Pack warriors every morning, pushing herself hard enough that after the first week, several of the veterans quietly revised their assessments of Lotus tribe wolves in general. She spent long hours with the Pack's healers. There had been injuries in the Valley battle, and the Silver Pack medical resources were optimized for war rather than recovery. Miranda had trained as a healer under the Lotus tribe tradition, and she put that knowledge to work with characteristic thoroughness, reorganizing the infirmary's protocols and establishing a post-battle triage system that Damien's medical commander noted, with grudging admiration, was significantly more efficient than what they had been doing. She sat in on war councils. She asked precise questions. She was occasionally wrong and acknowledged it cleanly when she was, and was occasionally right in ways that required the senior generals to revise their initial dismissal. And in the evenings, in the rare brief spaces between the constant urgency of preparing for a war that hadn't fully arrived yet, she and Damien navigated the strange private territory of two people bonded before they knew each other. It was not easy. Damien was, in private, almost exactly as difficult as advertised, controlled to a degree that sometimes felt like a wall rather than a quality, giving almost nothing voluntarily, operating on a default assumption that vulnerability was tactical weakness. He had been alpha since 19. The bones of who he was had set around the requirements of that role, and asking him to be different was asking water to run uphill. But the bond was relentless in its honesty. She felt his anger and the exhaustion beneath it. She felt in the quiet moments after he thought she was asleep, something that moved through the bond like grief. Old, unnamed, the kind accumulated over years of ruling alone with no one to share the weight of it. She didn't name it. She didn't push. She simply stayed. And Damien, who had not had someone simply stay in a very long time, noticed. One night, a week before the intelligence reports put the Shadow Alpha's next move at 10 to 14 days out, they were in the war room long after the others had gone. Miranda reviewing border maps, Damien reading intercepted rogue communications, and he said without looking up, "You're not what I expected." She marked her place on the map and looked up. What did you expect? Compliance, political performance, an alliance Luna. She considered this. Is that what you wanted? He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice he used when he said something true that he hadn't fully intended to say, I don't think I knew what I wanted. I built the alliance I needed and didn't think much beyond the immediate utility. And now? He looked at her. Now, he said slowly, I think I may have underestimated you significantly. It was not, by any conventional standard, romantic. It was not a declaration or a gesture or anything that poetry would have recognized as a moment, but Miranda had heard the things it was carrying underneath it. The admission of miscalculation from a man who never admitted error, the implicit acknowledgement that something had changed, the beginning, however guarded, of being seen. You're not what I expected either, she said. He raised an eyebrow. The stories make you sound like a weapon that walks like a man, she said. You're more complicated than that. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not a smile. Don't tell anyone, he said. She laughed. Briefly. Genuinely. The sound surprised them both. It was, Miranda thought later, the first moment that felt like them. Like what they might become if the world gave them enough time to find out. She hoped it would. The shadow revealed. The Shadow Alpha moved on the 13th day. He came not with an army this time, but with an emissary. A single rogue wolf, scarred and deliberately underfed to emphasize his fanatical loyalty, who walked up to the Silver Pack border post alone and announced he carried a message for the Luna, not the Alpha, specifically the Luna, and would die before giving it to anyone else. Miranda received him in the throne hall, seated beside Damien, which had been a point of discussion. Damien had wanted her in a secondary position, for safety, and she had argued against it with the precision of someone who understood that appearing to be protected was politically different from appearing to be a partner. And they had compromised on side by side, Miranda flanked by her own 2 Lotus guards who had come as part of the original escort and had quietly over the preceding weeks integrated themselves into the Silver Pack's warrior structure with a smoothness that spoke well of both sides. The rogue emissary looked at Miranda and delivered his message. The Shadow Alpha offered terms. Miranda would come to him willingly. In exchange, he would pull his forces back from all 12 tribe territories permanently. No more raids, no more burned villages, no more slaughtered bloodlines. Peace. The first genuine rogue wolf peace in a generation in exchange for the Lotus Luna. The emissary finished speaking and waited. The hall was very quiet. Miranda did not look at Damien. She looked at the rogue before her with those dark, steady eyes, and she sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "No." The emissary blinked. "Tell your Alpha that I was not given to the highest bidder before, and I will not be surrendered to the most dangerous one now," she said. "Tell him that the Silver Luna is exactly where she chose to be, and that she has no interest in his offer, his terms, or his governance. He will not accept He will accept whatever he must, Miranda said. And if he brings another army to these borders, he will face what he faced last time, plus whatever we've added in the intervening weeks. She rose from her seat. You will be given a safe escort to the border. I suggest you use it. The emissary left. In the silence afterward, Damien looked at her with an expression that, through the bond, felt like something deep and solid shifting into place. He'll move within 3 days, he said. I know, she replied. Then we'll be ready. She sat back down. She picked up the document she had been reading before the emissary was admitted. She continued reading. Across the table, Damien watched her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he returned to his own work. Soren, standing at his customary position near the wall, caught the eye of Miranda's guard Petra, the senior of her 2 Lotus escorts, and gave a small, very deliberate nod. Petra returned it. They had both been watching this unfold for weeks, the slow tectonic shift of 2 people finding the shape of each other, and they had both, independently, come to the same conclusion. The Silver Pack had needed a Luna for 12 years. They had finally got one. The final battle. The Shadow Alpha came himself. Not with an advanced force, not with scouts or skirmishers. He came with everything, the full assembled mass of his rogue army, because he had understood from the emissary's return that there would be no negotiation, and he had decided that overwhelming force was his only remaining strategy. He came under a blood moon. Miranda felt it too. Something in the bond, in her wolf, in the silver-white light that lived somewhere in her chest, responded to that red moon like a bell responds to a struck hammer. She felt more awake than she had ever felt, more present, more completely alive. Damien felt it through their bond, his mate, burning. The Shadow Alpha finally showed himself, and he was not, in the end, the monster of myth. He was a wolf, tall, powerful, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes the color of tarnished silver, bearing the scars of 100 battles and the controlled bearing of a genuine tactical intelligence. He was not feral. He was not mad. He was, Miranda understood as she looked at him across the field, simply a wolf who had chosen a different vision of how wolves should be organized and had been willing to kill any number of people to implement it. He looked across the assembled forces and found Miranda immediately. Not Damien. Her. And it was different from the first engagement in ways that Miranda only fully processed afterward. The first battle had been about numbers and shock, the sheer scale of the rogue force meeting the Silver Pack's superior discipline and coming apart. This battle was about 2 commanders who had studied each other, who had used the intervening weeks as both sides had, and who were now deploying everything they had learned against each other. He came under a blood moon. The moon that night was extraordinary, enormous, rust red, hanging low over the mountain peaks like a warning written in fire. The wolves of the Silver Pack felt it in their bones. The ancient moon pole turned up to a frequency that set the air vibrating. Some of the younger wolves reported their vision sharpening beyond normal capacity, their senses opening like windows thrown wide in a gale. Miranda felt it too. Something in the bond, in her wolf, in the silver-white light that lived somewhere in her chest, responded to that red moon like a bell responds to a struck hammer. She felt more awake than she had ever felt, more present, more completely alive. Damien felt it through their bond, his mate burning. Good, he thought. Let her burn. The rogue army arrived at midnight. The Shadow Alpha finally showed himself, and he was not, in the end, the monster of myth. He was a wolf. Tall, powerful, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes the color of tarnished silver, bearing the scars of 100 battles and the controlled bearing of a genuine tactical intelligence. He was not feral. He was not mad. He was, Miranda understood as she looked at him across the field, simply a wolf who had chosen a different vision of how wolves should be organized, and had been willing to kill any number of people to implement it. that made him in some ways more frightening than a monster. He looked across the assembled forces and found Miranda immediately. Not Damien. Her. You could have ended this without the bloodshed. He called out. His voice carried. So could you, she replied. Just as clearly. You had options other than burning villages. You chose the ones that killed the most people. I chose the ones that forced decisions. He said, that is what leadership requires. No, she said. What leadership requires is being accountable for the people you lead, not using them as pressure instruments against other people's choices. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man acknowledging an opponent worth fighting. Last chance, he said. No. The battle began. It was different from the first engagement in ways that Miranda only fully processed afterward. The first battle had been about numbers and shock. The sheer scale of the rogue force meeting the Silver Pack's superior discipline and coming apart. This battle was about two commanders who had studied each other, who had used the intervening weeks as both sides had, and who were now deploying everything they had learned against each other. The Shadow Alpha was good, genuinely, frighteningly good. He moved his forces with an adaptability that gave even the Silver Pack's veterans trouble, plugging gaps before they became vulnerabilities, redirecting pressure in real time, identifying and targeting the Silver Pack's command structure with surgical precision. But he had not accounted for the bond. He could not have, because the mate bond between a true fated pair in full battle was not something any existing tactical manual included. Miranda and Damien moved through the engagement as a single organism. Her perception and his authority, her wolf's terrifying presence and his unmatched combat skill, the bond between them serving as a command network faster and more accurate than any messenger system. She knew where he needed her before he asked. He covered her movements before she was aware she needed covering. They were together, something neither of them could have been alone. The tide turned at the third hour. The Shadow Alpha's left flank broke when Miranda brought her wolf forward with 3 of the Silver Pack's best warriors and hit the rogue line at its weakest point with the luminescent moon touch presence that sent the front ranks scrambling backward into the ones behind them, creating the cascade that Damien's main force immediately exploited. The rogue formation fractured, and then Damien found the Shadow Alpha. They met at the field's center in a space that had cleared around them, the way spaces clear around things that are too significant for bystanders to interrupt. 2 alphas, 2 wolves who had been on a collision course since the first burned village. The fight was brutal and short. Damien was not the better fighter in a technical sense. The Shadow Alpha had fought longer and accumulated more raw tactical experience. But Damien had the bond, and through the bond, he had Miranda. And at the moment when the Shadow Alpha had an opening, and should have taken it, the bond pulsed, Miranda's wolf light blazing across the field, and the Shadow Alpha hesitated. 1 second. Damien did not hesitate. It was done. The blood moon hung overhead, and in its rust-red light, the great rogue army saw their alpha fall. The war ended in the next hour, not with celebration, with the long, heavy silence that follows when something very large has finally stopped. Miranda found Damien afterward, standing at the edge of the field, looking at the red moon. She stood beside him. She didn't say anything. Through the bond, she felt the complex knot of what he carried, relief and exhaustion, and the quiet aftermath of violence. And, underneath it all, steady and new and unambiguous. Something that felt exactly like what she felt. She took his hand. He didn't look down at it. He just closed his fingers around hers and held on. Above them, the blood moon burned. Below them, the world began slowly to breathe again. The queen of the 12 tribes. 6 months later. The ceremony was not called a coronation because wolf culture had no word for what it was exactly. The 12 tribes did not appoint kings. They recognized power that already existed and formalized the acknowledgement of it in the most binding way their traditions allowed, under the full moon, before the moonstone, with every tribe's alpha present and kneeling. The moonstone had never been used like this. It had been a wedding site, a binding site, a place of promises. But the night of the ceremony, the pack elder stood before it with an expression of someone witnessing something that had been prophesied long enough ago that everyone had stopped expecting it to actually happen. The 12 alphas knelt in a circle around the moonstone. Miranda stood beside Damien at the circle's center. She was objectively not the same person who had ridden through the Silverpack gates 6 months ago. Not outwardly, she looked like herself, still tall, still dark-haired, still wearing that composed expression that people who didn't know her read as serenity, and people who did know her recognized as the visible surface of enormous, carefully organized will. But inwardly, she was someone who had fought a war and survived it, who had found a home she hadn't gone looking for, who had discovered in the terrible crucible of the last months that she was significantly more than she'd been taught to expect of herself. Damien stood at her left shoulder. He was wearing formal armor, and his expression was the studied neutrality he deployed for public events, but through the bond, she could feel the complicated private reality of it. The satisfaction, the pride, not in himself, not in the victory, but in her, and the threat of something vulnerable that she had learned in these months to recognize as love, even though he had not said the word yet, and she was honestly not certain he had the vocabulary for it. That was all right. She knew what it felt like. The word could wait. The elder raised her staff. The moon goddess has shown her will through the bond she created and the battle that bond won. She has shown her will through the marked wolf who walked among us in the darkness and sent the darkness back. She has shown her will through the stability that has come to the 12 tribes since the rogue threat was broken at these borders. Silence across the valley. Even the wind had died. Do the 12 tribes accept the sovereignty of Alpha Damien Silver and Luna Miranda Silver over the United Territories? 12 alphas in unison. We accept. The moonstone blazed. Not the detonation of the wedding night, something different. Something sustained and warm. Silver white light rising from the stone and a steady column that illuminated the valley for a full minute before fading slowly, like a held note, finally resolving. When the light faded, Miranda looked out at the circle of 12 alphas and 12 territories, at the assembled wolves of the Silver Pack and the Lotus Pack and the allied tribes beyond, and felt the full weight of it land on her shoulders with a solidity that was not crushing but structural. This was hers, all of it. The responsibility and the beauty and the terrifying fragility of a piece that was real but recent, that would require tending with the same relentlessness that the war had required. She was ready. Damien's hand found hers. She looked at him. He looked back, through the bond. No words. But the feeling was as clear as moonlight. You're not alone in this. She squeezed his hand once. He held on. 3 months after the coronation. The Silverpack fortress in winter was different than in wartime. Quieter, slower, the halls full of wood smoke and the particular warmth of a place that has been through something terrible and come out the other side still standing. Miranda woke before dawn, as she often did, and sat at the window of their chambers with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, watching the moonlit mountains. She had been trying to identify for 3 days a specific sensation. Something new. Something at the edge of the bond. Not Damien's presence, which she knew by now as well as she knew her own heartbeat, but something else. Something small and bright, and astonishingly loud in its silence. She heard him wake, felt the shift through the bond, the transition from deep sleep to immediate awareness that was characteristically him. The bed moved, footsteps. He came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the mountains. He was warm even in the pre-dawn cold. "You've been watching something," he said. "Feeling something," she corrected. A pause. "The bond?" "Near it. Around it." She put her hand very carefully against her own chest. "Here." She heard him breathe. She felt through the bond the moment he understood, the absolute, complete, full-body stillness that overcame him, as if the entire mechanism of him had briefly stopped to process something too significant for normal operation. His hand came forward. Slowly. He placed it over hers, and then, gently, moved it lower. His palm rested against her. The small, bright, impossibly loud silence sang beneath his hand. Damien, who had not been surprised by anything in 12 years, who had built a life and a kingdom on the foundation of controlling every variable, who had looked at wars and power struggles and the death of the closest thing to love he'd had before her, and had held himself together through all of it. Damien's breath left him slowly, like something releasing. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, unguarded in a way she had heard only twice before. Once, in the first full night after the wedding, when the bond was new and overwhelming. Once, on the battlefield in the minutes after the shadow Alpha fell. "How long?" he asked. "A few weeks, I think. The bond just started to show me." She turned to look at him. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. He was looking at her with an expression she had no prior reference for, not in him, not in anyone. As if something that had been braced against difficulty for so long had been given, without warning, a reason to put the weight down. "A boy?" he said. And she heard in the question that he already suspected, that the bond had been carrying something she hadn't consciously processed yet. She considered, felt inward. The small, bright presence felt like, "I think so," she said softly. He was quiet for a long time. His hand remained against her, and she could feel through the bond the careful, enormous process of him integrating this. The king, the alpha. The ruthless strategist who had never needed anything, integrating the fact that there was going to be a person, a new person, who was theirs. "The future alpha," he said. It was not a question exactly. "The future alpha," she agreed. He looked toward the mountains then, the moonlit peaks pale and enormous and ancient against the pre-dawn sky. And she watched his face and felt through the bond something she had hoped for and hadn't been certain of, something she had seen traces of in quiet moments and glimpsed in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Hope, simple and unguarded, and utterly unlike the ruthless Alpha King of legend. Just a man at a window at the beginning of a life he hadn't known how to want until the moon goddess sent him someone to want it with. They stayed at the window until the sun came up. In the valley below, the frost flowers were opening in the cold dawn air, white and silver, the way they always were in the Lotus Valley winters, small and indestructible against the freeze. Miranda had always loved that about them, the fact that they opened anyway, that the cold didn't close them, that something in them was built to bloom precisely when everything else withdrew. She leaned back against her husband's chest and felt his arms come around her. Outside, the 12 territories were waking. In the valleys and on the mountain passes and in the river lowlands and the frost flower fields, wolves who had spent the last year surviving were beginning carefully to do something that felt unfamiliar and fragile and absolutely necessary. living. The war was over. The peace was real. The future was beginning. But deep in the wilderness beyond the 12 borders, in the high, lightless passes where even rogue wolves did not go willingly, something else was waking. It had been watching since before the war began, since before the bond, since before Miranda arrived at the Silver Pack gates with her chin lifted and her 2 guards. It had watched the Shadow Alpha build his army and had waited to see if he would succeed, because his success would have been useful and his failure was educational. It was not a rogue wolf. It was not an alpha. It was something for which the 12 tribes had no current word, because the last time anything like it had walked the northern lands was long enough ago that it existed only in the very oldest texts, the ones the pack elders kept and rarely opened and never read from in public. It had a name in those texts: the moon's shadow, the counterweight. The thing the moon goddess had cast behind her when she walked forward into the world, the dark twin of her light, patient as stone, cold as the space between stars. The moon shadow had been sleeping, but the blazing silver light of the moonstone ceremony had called across the dark, the way a lamp seen from a great distance draws the eye of someone who is already looking. And now it was awake, and it was interested. Not in Damien, not in the 12 tribes, not in the new peace that everyone was so carefully, hopefully, tending. It was interested in the child, the future alpha, the one who carried both bloodlines, the ruthless strength of the Silver Pack, and the moon goddess's blessing of the Lotus line, in a combination that the oldest texts described in language too careful to be anything other than fear, because there was a prophecy. There was always a prophecy. And this one said that when the Silver King and the Lotus Luna's firstborn drew their first breath under the watching moon, a door that had been closed for 1,000 years would open. What came through that door would depend entirely on who stood in front of it. The moon's shadow intended to make sure it was not the child. In the Silver Pack fortress, Miranda woke suddenly in the dark hours. No dream she could name, no sound in the room, just the bond, steady and warm, Damien's presence quiet and sleeping beside her. And underneath it, very far away, very faint, something cold, watching. Damien, she said quietly. He woke instantly. What? She was quiet for a moment, feeling outward through the bond, through the pack bond, beyond it into the night. The war for the Wolf Kingdom, she said slowly, isn't over. Silence. His hand found hers in the dark. No, he said. I don't think it is. They lay in the dark together, listening to the night. The moon was watching. The moon was always watching. And somewhere in the lightless high passes, the moon's shadow smiled for the first time in 1,000 years. End of Book 1. The story continues in Fated to the Ruthless Alpha King. Book 2. The Moon's Shadow.